This video is going to be talking about air pollution, focusing on greenhouse gases, first of all. So the examples of greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide, methane gas, nitrous oxides, that can be nitrogen oxide or nitrogen dioxide, and CFCs, which is chlorofluorocarbons. The main three that contribute to the enhanced greenhouse effect is going to be carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides. They're all linked to the activity of humans. And carbon dioxide is definitely the main contributor to the enhanced greenhouse effect, and so to climate change and global warming. It's mostly the burning of fossil fuels that is believed to be contributing to the increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Methane gas is mostly coming from cattle farming, but also rice farming, so from the microorganisms in the stomachs of the cattle, and also bacteria decomposing waste as well as oil and gas production also give off methane gas. Nitrous oxide can cause air pollution from chemical fertilizers, but also the burning of fossil fuels. Another example of air pollution is carbon monoxide poisoning. So carbon monoxide will enter the air from incomplete combustion. So this is combustion or burning that happens when there's not enough oxygen present or where there's a lack of oxygen. It's quite difficult to detect because it's colourless, odourless and tasteless, but you can get carbon monoxide detectors for at-home use. Carbon monoxide is dangerous because it combines irreversibly with hemoglobin in your red blood cells, which means that the transport of oxygen by your red blood cells is reduced by carbon monoxide. And this can have an effect even at extremely low levels of carbon monoxide, because hemoglobin will bind to carbon monoxide far, far easier than it will to oxygen. The end result being then that your body can't transport enough oxygen, which can cause you to fall unconscious, or in extreme cases it can cause death. The next effect that we see is acid rain. So nitrous oxides, which we talked about before as being a greenhouse gas, but also sulfur dioxide. So they both come about from the burning of fossil fuels and then will dissolve into rainwater. So they'll dissolve into water vapor while it is in the clouds, which then means that when that water falls as rain, that it contains nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxide. Rainwater is naturally slightly acidic, kind of similar to how our skin is naturally slightly acidic, so kind of pH 5.5, pH of 6, so very slightly acidic. However, the presence of nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide do lower the pH more so than we would normally see, and that natural acidity does come from carbon dioxide that we would naturally find in the air and in the atmosphere, which then dissolves in water. Carbon dioxide will always dissolve in water if given the opportunity. Acid rain then, if it does fall, so this is extra acidic rain, not just the natural slight acidity, it will react with minerals in rocks and stone, which will dissolve them and slowly weathers and slowly erodes them. So it's a form of chemical weathering, which you may come across in geography as well. Just thinking about it then as a quick flowchart of these different effects. So sulfur and nitrogen is naturally found in fossil fuels. When fossil fuels are burnt, the sulfur and nitrogen will form sulfur dioxide and sulfur oxides as they enter the air. Sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides, as I said before, dissolve in the water vapor in clouds. And this is what's going to form sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And that's adding into the carbonic acid that we would normally find in rainwater from carbon dioxide. So when we say acid rain, it really is a combination of different acids actually that's present. So when we say acid rain, we mean a pH of lower than 5.5, which would be the normal slightly acidic pH of rain. Some of the side effects of acid rain then is that it can cause death to aquatic life, so that includes both plants and animals, and also to bacteria as well and other microorganisms. This can mean in some cases that acidified lakes appear clearer, or that they look kind of healthy and clean, but that's actually because so much of the aquatic life has actually died, and that it's actually suppressing the growth of what might end up making the water look less clear, making it look cloudy, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily a reflection of health, but it's actually because it's very difficult for aquatic life to survive in that water due to the acidity, because of the presence of enzymes, and those enzymes being potentially denatured by the acidity of the water caused by acid rain. Acid rain also causes destruction of leaves and roots, particularly of trees, and this particularly affects conifers. So trees, things like Christmas trees that have small kind of spines on them as their leaves. So rather than having kind of full-size leaves, is they've got reduced leaves anyway. And so the destruction of these reduced leaves and damage to the root system reduces photosynthesis and uptake of water and other minerals, which has a really detrimental effect on growth of trees and can kill trees. Acid rain will also damage limestone structures, so building work, brickwork on the outside of buildings, and also statues. So we see this a lot with statues that have been carved out of limestone and gravestones and that kind of thing, is that eventually they start to be eroded and worn away. Alright, so thinking then about global warming and about greenhouse gases, so going back to that concept. So global warming is what we mean when we say that is that there's a gradual increase in overall temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. So there are normal fluctuations that are happening all the time in the Earth's temperature, but that overall there's been a gradual increase in temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, and this is generally attributed to an enhanced greenhouse effect. So just a quick sketch to just recap this. There's some much better diagrams out there on the PowerPoints that you've got available and on the internet. If you look up greenhouse effect, there's loads of animations, loads of pictures out there, but just to give you an idea. So with the Earth, we've obviously got the atmosphere surrounding the Earth, and then we've got this really not at all in perspective sun diagram there, and so we've got rays of light, we've got radiation coming from the sun, which are going to pass through the atmosphere, that are going to hit the Earth's surface. Some of that radiation is going to be reflected by the atmosphere. That just happens normally. It's not a huge amount, but some of it will be reflected by the atmosphere. Some of that radiation gets absorbed by the Earth. That's why the surface of the ground gets warmer, particularly in the summer, and some of the radiation is going to just be reflected by the Earth, and some of that radiation then gets trapped within the atmosphere. So some of it will be reflected by the Earth and will go straight out into space, but some of it becomes kind of reflected and almost bounced around inside the atmosphere, and then kind of becomes trapped within the atmosphere. Now, when I've written this, as I've written energy, most of the diagrams use radiation. Really either is fine. You can talk about it as being waves of light radiation or energy. It's causing an increase in temperature, which is an increase in energy. Really either is fine, but as I said, most of the diagrams, particularly more of the physics-based diagrams, do talk about it as radiation. I've used the word energy here when I've written this, but it's fine either way. And then as it says there, energy from the sun enters the atmosphere. Some is absorbed by the Earth, some is reflected by the Earth. Some of that is going to end up going out into space, some of it is going to end up being absorbed by the atmosphere, and so it's going to increase the temperature of the atmosphere. And so some of that, as I've said before, some of that reflected energy or some of that reflected radiation is lost out into space. This is all totally normal, and a totally normal part of what keeps the Earth's atmosphere warmer. Without the greenhouse effect at all, it would be really, really cold, particularly when it's dark. So in terms of the difference then between global warming, which we attribute to the enhanced greenhouse effect, and just the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect by itself is really important. It's really necessary, and it's part of why life on Earth is possible. Because without it, anywhere that's dark, anywhere that's not constantly receiving radiation and energy from the sun, the temperature would fluctuate massively. It would become very, very cold, and it wouldn't be in any way stable or consistent at all. So the greenhouse effect is important. It's also why plants do better in glass greenhouses, is that it increases the temperature and it makes the temperature more consistent. The temperature doesn't go as low at night for plants in a greenhouse. However, an enhanced greenhouse effect, which is what we're talking about as being a problem and causing global warming, is where we've got too much energy or too much radiation being trapped by the atmosphere, so that it's more than normal, and so it's going to raise the temperature of the earth, raise the temperature of the atmosphere more than the normal increase we would see due to a normal greenhouse effect. And that graph there I've scrolled past already, but we can see that there are normal fluctuations of temperature throughout the years. Some years are warmer than others. Sometimes there's quite a lot of difference between different seasons, but what we can see is that in recent years there has been an increase that is greater than the normal fluctuation that we would see. And that graph from UK Met Office includes lots of different information. It's possible to track or to estimate what the temperature was during different years based off of the rings of trees and how they formed, and also the density and the different gaseous components of ice. So they can drill down and remove a really long core of ice, and then they can look at the, as I said, the density of the ice as it's frozen, what the chemical components are of the ice, to find out information about what the atmosphere was like, because what will end up in that ice, in the freshly frozen ice, will have been components from the air and from the atmosphere at the time of freezing. So bringing this back to the idea of human influences on the environment and how human activities contribute to this enhanced or increased greenhouse effect. So the main ones are going to be the burning of fossil fuels and food production. So that's going to mean farming, and then the increased production of methane gas from cattle and from fermenting paddy fields with rice as well. Methane by volume does have a larger effect on global warming than carbon dioxide does. So it's more effective as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, even though the quantities of it are much lower. In terms of consequences then, so increased global temperature, we would see melting of ice caps, rising of sea levels, which would inevitably have a knock-on effect in terms of flooding globally. Climate change in general, an increased temperature of the atmosphere does correlate with kind of more extreme weather, so more tornadoes, more tsunamis, that kind of thing, and human health impacts, particularly with diseases caused by insects, so insect-borne diseases, because generally insects are found in more tropical climates. But if the temperature globally increases by even just 1 or 2 degrees, is that the range at which those tropical insects will move increases dramatically. So we would see much larger movement and much larger ranges of those insects that carry insect-borne diseases. These past paper questions, though, do make sure you've had a go at them just before watching through these answers. So we've got... we're looking for 3 different harmful consequences of global warming. You can really pick any of those 3. So melting ice caps, raising sea levels and flooding. And then you could talk about climate change. You could talk about insect-borne diseases. You could also talk about loss of habitat as well for that one. So burning fossil fuels releases sulfur dioxide, explaining the biological consequences of pollution of air by sulfur dioxide. Now, because this talks about biological consequences, I wouldn't focus on damage to buildings and structures and statues, because it's not really a biological consequence. Instead, you would want to focus in on the effects on lakes and on trees, so acidification of lakes and damage to the leaves and roots of trees. It says explain, so I would include a bit of background information, a bit of how this comes to be, before moving on to thinking about why it's actually having an effect in terms of biological consequences. So we've got sulfur dioxide dissolving in water vapour in clouds, forming acid rain. So we've got acidification of lakes, which is going to kill aquatic life, so aquatic animals, aquatic plants as well, and other microorganisms. And we've also got acid rain damaging the leaves and roots of trees. You could also include here the disproportionate effects that it has on coniferous trees, so the fact that conifers are much more damaged by it. Looking here at this data, so there's data there, information about temperatures and different years. I've obviously scrolled past that quite quickly, but name a greenhouse gas. So methane, there are others you could pick as well, but it's just for 1 mark. What's meant by a greenhouse gas? So a gas that contributes to the greenhouse effect. So any gas that's going to absorb energy or to absorb radiation is going to be a greenhouse gas. But just for 1 mark, any gas which contributes to the greenhouse effect. And so an increased level of that gas could cause global warming by causing an enhanced greenhouse effect. Suggesting how human activities could be responsible, so we're just thinking of things that has changed in that time. So increased burning of fossil fuels, increased farming. Farming's gotten much more efficient as a process, but as a result of that is that there's much more methane gas that's being released by increased cattle farming, and also rice farming, so fermentation there as well also releases methane. You could be specific, you could list some specific gases that are increased by burning of fossil fuels, so carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and then cattle farming and rice farming is going to increase methane. This is really a suggest question, which means you would have quite a lot of freedom for different answers. You could also talk about some reasons why burning of fossil fuels might increase, such as increased travel in cars and planes.